Welcome, adventurers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today, we're joined by Emily Leonick. With 7 years of experience in the gaming and tech industries, Emily is a seasoned narrative game producer and content strategist known for her exceptional storytelling prowess and project management skills. Join us as we explore the resurgence of text-based games and visual novels and uncover the evolving landscape of immersive storytelling in gaming. Emily, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. It's exciting to be here.
It is more exciting for me, I assure you. We were in the narrative department's masterclass together, and you impressed me a lot. So I was really excited to get a chance to chat with you a little bit more and dig into some stuff with you.
Oh, that's exciting. I felt like I was just kind of throwing things out into the universe and not sure if anyone was reading what I was writing down.
I assure you we were at 100%. But speaking of writing, we're here today to talk about text-based games and visual novels and the resurgence that's happening in those kind of narrative-based games. But before we dig into it, I like to start with a little bit of a foundation. Share with me your origin story. How did you fall in love with games and writing? What was your career journey? Take me through it.
Wow. Okay. Origin story is a little massive. I was a Nintendo 64 kid. I distinctly remember getting it for Christmas one year, me and my older sister. All I really remember is like the Donkey Kong game where you would fly around. And then I really liked Pokemon Stadium, but just the mini games, not the actual fighting part. Because, children.
Right.
And then my other foray into gaming until I was in college was Nancy Drew games, which, yes, are really good. They are, for the most part, really well written. The puzzles are good. Like, it's everything that I want. I just kind of want to like sit down. I want to solve a crime. I want to, do a Sudoku puzzle. So that really appealed to me. So that was where I was for a really long time. And then my love of really more AAA narrative-based games, it definitely kind of came later in life because I didn't realize they were a thing. And then Mass Effect entered my life because somebody in GameStop told me to play it. And I ended up writing about it for my sci-fi class in high school. And I had my teacher tell me, you have a really good eye for things. You should consider writing more. And I went, yeah, absolutely. I love to write. Give me a notebook, I'll fill it. So went to college. I have an English degree. I can tell you what you do with a BA in English. What you do is content marketing and then content strategy. And then you slowly work your way into gaming and become a narrative producer.
Whatever it takes, right?
Yeah. The thing I really like about gaming in every conversation that I think I've ever had with someone is there are the people who knew from minute one that is what they wanted to study and that is what they wanted to do. There are people who are it's their second degree because, they had a whole career and they hated it and they're like, I want to work in games. And for me, I was very lucky that it was kind of a natural progression for me because the content strategy work got me in EA. And then EA has a thing once you're there for a year, you can apply for anything else. And Maxis had a narrative production role open up. And I went, I'm going to apply for that. I'm not going to get it, but I'm going to apply for it. And then, 4 months later, there I was working on The Sims.
Oh, that is cool. That's a good story. I love it.
Yeah.
I like to also ask quite often, did you play tabletop games? Did you play board games growing up? Did you any physical space games?
I played a good deal of board games, mostly whichever ones I could convince my older sister to play because, for a long time, those were the friends that I had around. I was a little late into tabletop games, but when I got into it in college, it kind of became my identity for a minute. I DM'd a couple of games back to back. I DM'd a game that took 3 of the 4 years I was in college. Nice. Which was really fun because most of my friends were a little bit older than me. So it was trying, once they graduated, it's okay, I need you to be somewhere in the space. We need to meet somewhere. And I am also a little, I went, oh, there are tabletop games beyond D&D. let me find out about them. So I actually ended up getting really into Cyberpunk, which was really, really fun when people were starting to play Cyberpunk 2077, because it was like, I have information about this universe. Please come talk to me. I want to nerd out with you. So my friends definitely got backstory they did not need about Johnny Silverhand and all that good stuff. But yeah, I feel like I was a little late into realizing that gaming and narrative had an intersection, just because I feel like the zeitgeist wasn't exactly there when I was growing up.
That makes sense. All right, well, that's the foundation. That's the basis. Let's move into the topic of the day. And kind of to move us into it, to set the stage, what is your definition? How would you define modern day text-based games? Like, there's the AAA, there's the narrative, but then there's also other stuff going on, like itch and other stuff. I'm curious, what is your definition?
I would say, for me personally, I kind of look at text-based games, anything that is heavy on the player having agency to know how much is going on, if that makes sense. Whereas it's sometimes with like other RPGs and things like that, you have information thrown at you in like cutscenes and this, that, and the other thing. Where I look at text-based games, it's you can probably skim, get the idea of what you need, and decide which options you need to pick, or you can really take that deep dive. So I think it's kind of like some equivalent of a book, but I think text-based games have really also moved beyond just being 100% text-based. Yeah. So it's definitely its own genre now.
Yeah, for sure. Do you play, like, do you ever wander into itch.io and try some of the text-based?
Yeah, I really enjoy doing it. When in the game writing masterclass that we took together, actually, some of the work that we had to do ended up in itch, and I went, oh, I want to see what else is out there. And some other classmates of ours shared projects they had been working on, and I went, oh, I've totally missed this section of the internet.
Yeah. Let
me take a deep dive. So I really enjoy them. I like that sometimes they can get very experimental. I love that. I love the idea of indies and solo projects just being like, I'm going to do something cool. I'm going to do something maybe out of the norm that might not work, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I really enjoy itch. I find when I'm in like a really big creative slump, going to see other people's creative works, especially, I feel like itch and I are closer than, me opening up Steam for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Other people's good stuff makes me want to make good stuff, basically.
Very cool. There is a lot of really interesting stuff on there. Like you say, people experimenting with different formats and ways for the text to appear and interact with you. It's really cool.
Yeah, I really love it. There's some that it's like the old school, just here's a bunch of sentences, here are these 3 radio buttons, pick one, that kind of branching narrative. And then I ran into one that was a lot more visual, in that you had to, it was almost more along the lines of like a puzzle, where like you had to find things in the environment that would unlock other parts of the story, which was really, really cool.
That is very cool. Okay, well, digging into that, I guess, seeing this resurgence, in your opinion, why are people moving to something like, I've talked to a lot of different people who have said there's this growth in that kind of game, these cozy text-based adventure and exploration and visual novel games. What do you think the reason is?
I think the answer is kind of twofold, where part of it is that the technology is better and more user intuitive, which gives, creative people the chance to do something that they necessarily wouldn't. So somebody could write a short story where they can turn it into interactive fiction because, there are programs out there that just make it easy as drag and drop, which I think is great. And I think the other part of it is just the audience is there. The audience, I feel like, especially for like those cozy kind of games, there's definitely been more eyes on it, more people, and things are just more readily available. And you could do it, you could play it on your phone most of the time now. It's partly because the technology is there for the creatives, the technology is there for the audience. So I think that is a big part of it.
Very much. It would be cool. You mentioned the idea of interactive fiction. It would have been cool to see like Poe or Hemingway or Austen come up with, like, if the tools had existed hundreds of years ago or whatever, what would they have done with it? Like, who would you have wanted to see write something interactive?
Ooh, okay. So part of me really wants to say Jane Austen just because I took a history of the modern novel class in college, and one of the books that we read was basically a choose your own adventure of a bunch of Austen stories kind of mashed together. And I really thought that was a cool idea. I think that Rip Jane Austen, you would have loved interactive fiction, basically. I also think Poe would have had a really cool time of it, but he also would have very much done the experimental things where you either get it or you don't, that kind of thing.
Which would have been so cool. I would have been all over that.
Oh yeah, I would have nerded out about them both equally.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well, digging back into video games and tech space and narrative in general, because kind of this does apply to bigger games, AAA games. Baldur's Gate 3, like, there's a lot of narrative involved in that, and there's a lot of text. What do you think the interaction between the two is? Like, how is that landscape evolving based on the big AAAs coming out and what's happening in that indie scene?
I think there has been, it's almost like which came first, the chicken or the egg, where you have those like indie games, those text-based indie games, those visual novels, and people who are working on games realizing you can give a player more. Like, you don't need to handhold him the whole time. So Baldur's Gate, for example, I want to say the biggest example that I can think of is I was talking to somebody about Kaga in the Druid Grove, and I was like, oh yeah, I did the thing with the Shadow Druids, and they were like, what? And I'm like, oh, you missed an entire storyline.
Yep.
And games like Baldur's Gate not only lend themselves really well to stuff like that, partly because, it's based on D&D and D&D. Any good DM is ready for a side quest. And that is side quest central. Yeah. So I think, especially with more people playing D&D, I feel like wanting more narrative stuff is just kind of that is the ask of the audience, and there's opportunity for it to be fun, and it can go really, really well, it can go really, really poorly, but I think experimenting is really the only way to go.
I'm not sure if it's biased because it's what we look for, but it does feel like there's an explosion of narrative-based games and emotionally driven games with strong stories, as opposed to just jump in and shoot things or just platform jump, or like people are adding that extra element to that extra level.
Yeah. I think even with games like Battlefield, which you would traditionally think of as a jump in and let's shoot things, like when I was at EA, one of my mentors was the narrative director for the entire at one point it was just one game. I think she's the entire franchise at this point. I could be wrong. I haven't spoken to her in a minute. But it's like knowing that even games like that have the narrative backing behind them. It's even a shooter, I feel like people want more. They want to know why they're doing it. It's not Fall Guys is one thing. I just want to go have some fun with my friends. I want to play Mario Party. I want to play a board game. But especially with more solo experiences, I feel like there needs to be a more of a driving factor behind it, or else I'm not sure it's going to resonate the way that, developers want it to.
That makes sense. Pulling it back to text-based.
Yes.
And technology. Like, we know how technology impacts games that are graphic driven and AAA games, but when game is like an itch.io, it's an Odyssey or a Twine game that's stripped down. How do you think changes in technology impact those games? Can they? Is it actually a hindrance, or are there advances that are helping us?
I think there's never going to be a point where people who just want to make text-based games don't. I think having the option with the technology is always a good thing, because I love to see people, take the reins on something new, and it's when, oh, okay, I was writing this text-based game, but a Twine has the option to make it a visual novel. I'm going to try that and see what happens. Maybe it doesn't ever reach the internet. Maybe it lives somewhere on your hard drive, but I don't think technology in that respect is going to be a hindrance. There are definitely places where I feel like technology might be doing too much. I think any writer definitely has its concerns with the AI. I mean, not even every writer, every artist, every creative in some respect kind of has that like wariness of AI, because people think it can just replace an entire team, and it can't. But I think if technology is used responsibly, it's not really a hindrance, especially with more of those text-based games. I think that there's just a lot of opportunity to experiment with programs that weren't really there maybe 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. I want to shift gears and talk about your narrative producing for a hot minute here. But before we do, yeah. I'm curious, do you get the itch, get what I did there, to write in Twine? Have you worked on itch? I love the thumbs. Is that something you have the interest in?
Yes. So I'm starting a bunch of projects in Twine that, again, never see the light of day, but it's something I love having the platform there. I love having the opportunity to work on something, and it's like I don't have to find people who want to be involved in this thing that I'm working on. It gives me the opportunity to do it myself, and then it gives me the opportunity to share what I want when I want. It gives me a lot of freedom. I certainly have the itch for itch. It's just one of those things that I think a lot of writers fall into, where I want things to be perfect, and sometimes they just have to be. So,
yep, there's an old saying, finished is better than perfect.
Yeah, that is something I am constantly trying to remind myself, just because it's like, I don't have an excuse. I have access to Twine. I know how to use it. I have access to itch. I know how to use it. There's no reason I can't do this other than my brain being mean to me.
Oh, the artist curse.
We love it.
And we hate it. All right. Narrative game producer. That's a cool title. I like that title.
It is a really cool title. It certainly means something different to everyone. There aren't a ton of narrative producers kind of out in the industry at the moment. So what I did as a narrative producer at one studio is different than what I do as a narrative producer in another studio, which is different what somebody else does at a studio. It's kind of a flux position, but I think it's a really cool, unique way to not only be able to help tell a story, but make sure it is told well.
Can you give me like a Cole's note, your version of this is what when the tires hit the road, this is what you do? Like, I'm really curious.
Yeah. So for me, and what most of the roles that I have been in as narrative producer, it's part basically game writer. I do a lot of the copy myself. I also work with anybody else who wants to do copy. Sometimes that's designers. Sometimes that's, a programmer who's really passionate about the story they're trying to tell.
That's cool.
And I work with them, which I love, because it also gives me the opportunity to like poke my head in and see what they're doing with their job. And it's like, oh, maybe I do want to learn coding again. Maybe I don't want to give up on JavaScript this time because maybe it'll be useful to me. Maybe I can do something with it. So it's that really cool, like being able to share knowledge. I would never be like, no, you're not a writer. I'm not going to let you do this. Like, that's so stupid. But it's partly that writing and editing that you kind of associate with any writing copy job. And then the other half is basically project management. Sometimes it is big picture. Hey, we need to get these features from column A to column B. And sometimes it's just babysitting, like, hey, I noticed you said you would do this thing and you haven't. Can you please do the thing? Thank you. And then kind of the third pillar is working with narrative designers to make sure that the story is cohesive. It's sometimes, especially the longer you work on something, the longer something has been out and you're adding more to, it's really easy to lose continuity. And so I kind of look at narrative production as the gatekeeper to continuity.
That's so cool. I'm really jealous. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It is. I really love it. It's sometimes hard to convince people they need a narrative producer because they're like, oh, we have designers already. What do we need you for? And it's like, I kind of fill this gap that you don't realize is there, but put me in and you'll notice how much better everything gets.
Love it. Everybody needs one.
Yeah. I think everybody who writes any sort of narrative, who does anything narrative for their game, should at least have either, if not a full-time narrative producer, like somebody who comes in and like checks on it once in a while, or somebody who is more on the production side of things and not the narrative design of things, because they can take a little bit more of an analytical look at the story and make those decisions of, if something needs to be cut, if something doesn't make sense, where I am definitely guilty of this as a writer, where I get very attached to my ideas and it's like, I will make it work. And sometimes you just can't. And that's kind of what the narrative producer needs to be there to like, be like, it's okay. We're just going to close this book. We'll come back to it later.
Put that in a folder and put it in the cabinet and walk away.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, pulling this back to the topic of the day, putting on your narrative producer hat and taking a look, excellent, taking a look at narrative-driven games or even strictly narrative, like toying games, versus something that's more graphic, something with AAA. What is the difference there, from a producer's point of view?
There's a lot more moving parts. There are a lot more cooks in the kitchen. I feel like with a very narrative heavy game or even just a regular text-based game, the narrative is front and center. That is what we care about. That is what we're going to do. All resources go to that. The more complex you get, the more teams that you need, narrative can get lost in the shuffle. And that's another reason I really love narrative production, to kind of wrangle people in. Like, I know cutscenes need to look fantastic and I know weapons need to look cool, but also this part is important, and this is not something we can just think about 2 weeks into localization text lock. Like, these are things that we need to focus on. And so there are some teams who do it really, really well and understand that, visually things need to be amazing and the music needs to be good and it needs to run properly. But the story is another pillar there. It is not an afterthought. And some studios don't do that. And I feel like you can tell.
Yeah, you can. I love that you're basically a story champion. You're the person who stands there and stands up for the narrative and says, hey, let's pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah. And there are definitely, I guess they'd be narrative directors or titles, but there's somebody more high level who worries about it for the whole game.
Right.
Whereas narrative producers, I think, worry a lot more about the day-to-day. And so I worked on The Sims 4, and that is, a lot of different packs, anywhere from like 2 to 4 being developed at once. And you have The Sims, which has, really expansive lore of like 3 games in however many years. And with everybody working on everything and someone being like, oh, I'm just going to bring in, Bella Goth into this. It's like, okay, that needs to make sense though. And somebody who's looking at the overarching story like a director will see, okay, cool, we're going to add this story from this part over here. Whereas my job as a narrative producer was to, dig into that lore Bible that exists and go, hey, Bella Goth has done this, this, and this. This has happened to her in her iterations. Would this make sense in the universe? Yeah, I lost my train of thought, but
That's
what I mean.
Yeah, I 100%. Our mutual friend Liv is a lore master or lore keeper, and it sounds like that's a big part of what you do as well, is maintaining that lore.
Yes, it is also really fun for me personally because I am a giant nerd, and I'm one of those people where I'm like, hey, you saw this like teeny tiny thing? You saw this one codex entry or this one character in the background? Well, here, let me tell you all about what that happened in the last game or the last, TV show episode, any of that. So like that has always been my bread and butter. And a lot of that is research. And I love to just be able to like sit down and take a deep dive into things. And it's just, I don't know, it's cool to get to play video games as my job. And you can't know the lore if you don't play the game.
I'm completely spinning off for a second here.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you were a DM. Are you still playing? Do you still run D&D or a tabletop game of some sort, Cyberpunk something?
I'm working on a Cyberpunk Red campaign, which will be the first game that I've actually run in the system since Cyberpunk 2077 came out, which is good because I don't have to beg nearly as hard to get people to join. But I haven't run it yet. I've been a player in the last couple of games that I've played, which is always really fun, especially when you DM a lot. It's like, oh wait, I get to have fun and be told things too, and that's always really it's good. But at the same time, I'm like, excuse me, DM, do you have lore on this? Can you tell me more about this village, please?
Yep, that's what we do when we're not behind the screen. Not that I'm always behind the screen, but the question I was getting to there was, when you were DMing, were you a world builder? Like, was that a gem did you run homebrew?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, Cyberpunk, I ran a game. I think it was only 3 or 4 sessions, but it was based in Texas, which there just isn't a ton of information on in the Cyberpunk universe. Like Johnny Silverhands from College Station originally, I am like 98% sure he hid there with the Nomads at one point after the bombing of Arasaka in the not Cyberpunk 2077 line of events because he wasn't dead. But I kind of beyond that, it's its own republic, and that's kind of what we know. So I went, well, I live here. Let me think about what's going on. So that was also very interesting because I hadn't been living in Texas very long at that point. And anybody who lives in Texas is incredibly proud of Texas in like a way that I just don't understand. So it was part like homebrew, building my own lore in a universe to make it make sense, but also like I have to connect it to these players who have lived here their entire life. Like I have to make them care, and it has to at least somewhat make sense.
That's so cool. The fact that we do that for fun is what makes us so good when we actually sit down to write or build or create something. It's because we're doing it all the freaking time anyways. You can't stop. It's always there.
Yeah, that is the best part of any sort of game job that I have. It's like, I'm going to do this anyway. I get paid to do this. Like, it's really cool. I get to work with other really awesome creative people that I maybe wouldn't even ever meet if I were just sitting alone writing a book, or if I was playing D&D with the same group of people that I've been playing D&D for years. So it's so nice to get to flex your creative muscles in a different way, but it's also really nice because I feel like it's a great meeting of the minds where everyone kind of has their own approach to things. So you're all trying to accomplish the same goal, but maybe you're going to learn like a new style of doing things, or maybe somebody's going to ask a question that you never would have thought of that'll fill a giant gap in your world building that you just didn't know was there.
I love it when they do that, when the players are like, I want to know more about this, and then I'll go home and sit down for 6 hours and world build. I love it.
Yes.
Great.
It's like, you want to know more about this orphan child? Don't worry. I will give you their entire family lineage.
Yep. And it's going to be tragic, and you're going to cry, and welcome to my world.
Also, surprise, they're a long-lost prince. You gotta you now have a quest. You gotta get this child across the ocean.
Yep. And it turns out you're related somehow too, just because.
Exactly. You know, all the good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Look at us just wander completely off topic, but that's fun. I love it. This is what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the most fun part of like any sort of recorded conversation. It's like you have your list of things that you want to talk about, but 9 times out of 10, who knows if you'll even get to them all, because you're going to find something and you want to talk about that for like 15 minutes.
The whole point of doing this is because there's smart people like you out there, and I want your knowledge. So it's completely selfish.
That's valid. I also like to listen to the sound of my own voice sometimes, so super fun. But
well, here's a video.
Yeah, right. But it's also really nice because you're gonna ask me something that I would just never think of. It's another one of those things, like I get to do something really cool, and we're gonna make something awesome, even if it's not where we started.
And the cool thing is collaboration. It's like I sit down with like, okay, I want to kind of talk about this. You sit down and you're like, hey, I want to talk about this, and then we meet in the middle somewhere and we start just spitballing.
Yeah, exactly. I think a major murderer of any creativity is just rigidity, and this is what you have to accomplish.
Yeah. And
you're only allowed to think about the scope of this. I feel like going back to games and writing.
What?
Look at it go. Any decent development team will give narrative leeway where and when they can. Because certainly you have to think about the resources, and, you know, maybe all of a sudden a new cutscene needs to be animated. Maybe, you know, somebody has to hard code and find somewhere in this map to put this book. But if you can have that leeway, 9 times out of 10, you're going to make something even cooler. And so if I were to offer a piece of advice to anybody who is thinking big picture and maybe hasn't worked with a narrative team or not very extensively, do what you can to give them a little leeway. Let them be creative. And, you know, maybe somebody writes 12 pages of cut content. That's fine. But you never know when that's going to come in handy.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And speaking of collaboration, kind of wandering again still here, but when you're working on a bigger studio game or Sims or something big like that, obviously there's a lot of collaborations, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of departments. But when it comes to a Twine game, even like there are smaller studios who are building more text-based, even if with visual, like Small Lone Studios, our fellow classmates comes to mind. Yes. What do you think the collaboration process, what are some of the big differences we need to keep in mind when it comes to working collaboratively on a text-based game?
I think the best thing that you can do is have that upfront kickoff conversation of what is a text-based game to us? What are we trying to accomplish? Because the truth of the matter is, you think it's very restrictive because it's all just singularly text and maybe a fancy color or two, or it's, you know, 4 backgrounds and 3 character models. But the truth of the matter is, that it's going to mean something different to everybody. And I think the best thing you can do to have a successful project is to start there and not just have one person with a vision and everybody else kind of following in. Like, you need buy-in from everybody. That is the sign of good collaborators, but also to making a successful game, in my opinion.
100%. What a good answer.
Thank you. I try.
All right, well, we are starting to kind of run on time here, so I'm going to start bringing us kind of to the head here. So when comparing text-based games to more traditional modern games, how important do you think it is in a modern game, like a AAA game or even just a graphically based game, how important is it to balance narrative and that text-based and the story with mechanics? Like, where is the balance there?
So I think the best example of the balance being a little off is LA Noire, which has an amazing story. The graphics were very ahead of its time because they were some of the first to really have that facial mapping. But the main complaint that I get anytime that I tell people it's one of my favorite games, you should really play it, it's okay, but it's the same like 3 mechanics the entire game. Press X to doubt it's good. But there's definitely a balance to be struck, and there are games that are there mostly for the mechanics and not for the story, and I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but Noir kind of shifted the other end of the spectrum. There needs to be that balance, but I feel like most of the time it's the other way around, where in my experience working with some more graphically intensive studios, it's narrative is an afterthought. I'm brought in, 4 weeks before the game is locked. And it's like, it's great you left all these little breadcrumbs here, but they don't make sense. They're not going to connect in the way that you want them to. So I think the balance is definitely not thinking of narrative as an afterthought and having that conversation in the beginning of like, how much do we want? Right. And how are the mechanics going to inform that? Because there's absolutely no reason why the two shouldn't work hand in hand.
That's a conversation that came up in the masterclass, was how early should narrative be involved in, like, is it ideation? In your opinion, how early? Because there were opinions expressed that I didn't necessarily agree with. There were people who were like, you don't need to be there right at the beginning. And I'm like, I think you should be, but where do you stand?
I also think the earlier you can bring narrative in, the better. I think ideation, even if it's just like big picture, I'm thinking about writing a novel, or, if you want to make a movie, you can't not have a story. And so you all have to be on the same page at once. And maybe right then and there for ideation, narrative's role is to be like, okay, here's plot point number 1, plot point number 2, plot point number 3, beginning, middle, end. High level, I don't need to have everything dished out right now. We have a main character because you want them to be, this super dope space marine. Cool. Work on the mechanics for that. Figure out how you want them to jump. Figure out if you want them in space or on a ship, or are they just hanging out on a planet? Like, that's all fine, well, and good. But having the story person there at the beginning, even if that's mostly a listening conversation and not, hey, I have things to contribute, I think go a long way into making a polished end product. And people definitely disagree with me.
People are always going to disagree with us. Whatever. I agree with you.
Sorry, I'm right.
You mentioned novels, fiction. Mm-hmm. I swear you mentioned once in a previous conversation that at one point you thought you were going to be like in book publishing. That was at one point a dream.
Yes. If you asked me at 22 where I was going to work the rest of my life, I would have said book publishing. I did a book publishing internship. I ghost wrote novels with the grad students because, we were all broke, and I actually interned with the book publisher that was part of the grad program for the creative writing program. And so I made friends, and a few of them like ghost wrote romance novels on the side. And, I can do that, so I would. And it is my ambition to one day finish a book and get there again. But kind of where I am in life now, I don't necessarily think book publishing and I would have gotten along as well as I had hoped.
I guess the line of questioning I'm digging at there, though, is, in your opinion, as somebody who originally had a passion for the long fiction, what are the similarities and differences between static long fiction novels or novellas or whatever it is you're into versus virtual novels, visual novels, text-based games? What are the big differences there, or similarities?
So now that you've asked that question, I've just had an epiphany in that I have always had this line of thinking. I've always been more interested in interactive fiction because my senior project I was originally pitching it as, what does the death of the author look like in the digital age? Because this was the time when writer who will not be named was, making characters gay, not in the actual story, and adding things after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And so my senior project was, I was writing a story as if it was a Wikipedia page, and you could click onto different things and learn more about, it's basically like a codex, and
Mm-hmm.
you're going around a map, and maybe you want to read about, the things that was happening in this office. But I did that, and the other part of the project was I updated it periodically and didn't tell anyone I was doing it, and then just be like, hey, I added a new chapter, go read it and see who noticed and see what people thought based on the new information, and kind of what, basically having the availability to always change something in the way that you do on like Wikipedia, what that does to a reading experience. And the more that I say about that, the more that it sounds like, I was writing interactive fiction and not a static novel. And I don't think I ever clicked until just now. So I think that there are a lot of similarities, but I think that interactive fiction just gives you more freedom, and it gives you, I don't want to say more of a community because that's not right. Authors and their readers are at times a little too codependent on one another, but it gives you a new way of interacting with the world, which I think is really cool.
Giving your reader, your audience, the ability to interact and change the story and contribute to the story makes them buy in, and it makes them emotionally involved. So you can do way more stuff with their feelings at that point. You can hurt them more. You can make them happier. Like, they're more in.
You know what that sounds like to me? The conversations you have as a narrative worker on a game.
Wow, it all comes together. Epiphanies all around.
I genuinely can't believe I have never put those two together before.
Nice. Happen right here.
Podcast exclusive.
That kind of brings us to the end of like the digging parts, but I'm curious, what is your favorite text-based game?
Okay, so I feel like I will get a little flack just because there are, other mechanics, but I really love the game Hacknet. It is basically on sale every Steam sale there is. You can grab it on Humble Bundle, all of that. The amount of people I've been like, look, you just need to play this. Like, it's a hacking simulator. You can be a white hacker, which is, someone doing things for the good, or you can just be a bit of a jerk. You kind of have like those branching options of what kind of hacker you want to be. But I think it tells a very interesting story in that you are trying to find a hacker who has gone missing, and you have to find out what they were working on and what is going on in the world around them and what happened to them. And then there is one DLC for the game that you are in a group of hackers, and there's a plane and you hack into the plane, but you're trying to save the plane, but you're not trying to save the plane. It's a whole thing. It is probably one of my favorite game narratives. And all I originally wanted to do was go beep boop, I'm in. So it was definitely, it crept up on me, but I love that game to death.
All right. Well, that's the end of that whole conversation. But before we start heading for the door, I do have a couple things I'd like to do for everybody. There's a question that I ask absolutely everybody who comes on, regardless of what industry they're from or what they're into. And that question is, in my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of story and game, but also board game design and interactive fiction and comedy and improv and all these things, where we can all just get together and hang out. There's a shared language. There's just this fellowship. If you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you agree with me, what is the magical thread that holds all this together?
Everybody just wants to have a good time. Like, everybody just wants to do something cool and maybe play a little bit of pretend. Everyone does it differently, but we all kind of want the same thing at the end of the day.
Nice. That's the first time anybody's answered that question with party.
Yeah.
We just want party.
The answer is party.
Nice. All right. Well, we're going to start wandering for the door, but first, little quick fire questions just to get to know you a little bit better. Top of mind answers. Don't think too hard about them. What are you currently playing?
I'm replaying the Dragon Age series because everyone's getting excited for the new one. It's been a casual 10 years.
Yeah. Yep. Veilguard. It'll be interesting. What are you currently reading?
So I am a dual reader. I will just go, hey, I want to read this. Hey, I want to read that. So right now I'm reading No Coincidence, which is the Cyberpunk 2077 novel. Shocked. And I'm also reading a book called Horror Store by Gertie Hendricks, which is basically an apocalypse in an IKEA.
Nice. I didn't realize you were that big of a Cyberpunk fan. That's cool.
Yeah, nobody knows until you let me talk about it, and then I won't shut up about it.
Well, maybe that's another episode, another conversation we'll have another time, because I could go down, as long as we throw some Shadowpunk and Cyberpunk, like we're Shadowrun and Cyberpunk, then we're good.
Hell yeah.
Okay. 2 more quick fires. 1, if you could collaborate with any novelist to bring their creation to a narrative video game, who would you want to bring to the game?
Okay, so my immediate thought is like, Agatha Christie, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Carolyn Keene, all people whose works have been made into really good mystery games. I think if I am not going to use any of those, I would really love to see a Jane Austen game. I think she could have some fun. You get, a good political thriller in there. Just new papers, please, but written by Jane Austen.
I'm sure there'd be all kinds of scorned romance and tricky relationships.
Oh, yeah.
All right, last one. And this is the hard one. If you could host a game session with any 4 people, living or dead, from any time in history, who would they be and what would you play?
My immediate thought is, since we've been talking about tabletop games so much, I would love to be at a table with Matthew Lillard. Matthew Lillard just seems like he's having so much fun anytime he does something. Yep. And I just want to vibe with him. We can talk about Scooby-Doo. We'll throw him in. Let me think. Who else? I, weirdly enough, think Stanley Tucci would also be a great tabletop game player because he's going to get into everything. He is going to become somebody else. And I love that in a table environment. Obvious answer is Mike Pondsmith. I want him to be running the table because we're obviously going to be playing Cyberpunk. And I think, oh man, I don't know who else I'd want. You know what? I want you, Gerald. I think that could also be fun. We're clearly having a good time, so I think we could make something cool together.
Well, I am slowly putting together a online game, so they'll put you on my list.
I was like, you'll see me there. Whether you want me there or not, I will show up.
Wonderful. But that's a really cool group. I'm going to age myself. You say Matthew Lillard, I think Hack the Planet. Like that's my Matthew Lillard, but I get Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, SLC Punk also holds a special place in my heart, but that was a little before my time. Uh, I am both older and younger than everyone thinks I am, so
Got an old soul kind of thing.
I guess that, or like I will just like I will fall down rabbit holes of stuff like I don't know, like cyberpunk, like when that was written, that was the 80s. All right, cool. I'm gonna fall down that rabbit hole and see what they thought the future was then. That kind of stuff.
Did you go back and read Gibson stuff? Have you read Neuromancer and all the old William Gibson stuff that is kind of like some of the foundational work?
I have started it. That was also a point where I was just out of college and I had spent 4 years reading books, and I went, if I never read anything again, I'll be great. So I am very much bounced back the other way. Thank God.
Gotcha. All right. That's it for my quickfire questions. Before we head out the door, I do like to hold a little space. If there's anything you want to promote, anything you need to signal boost, you got working, it's going on, or if not, where can people find you online? Either or both.
Yeah, I don't have anything in the pipeline that I can talk about, which is always super fun. But if anybody needs to find me, I am on most social media platforms under my name, Emily Leonick, or M of Pentacles, because, you're a tarot girly, and I have a website, also my name, and LinkedIn. Yeah, you can find me around.
All right, well, I am going to push you out the door into the cold, my friend. I'm sorry, but before you go, I'm going to give you the final word. Any
Okay.
parting words of wisdom as I push you out the door?
Have fun.
As the stars start to come out and yell at us with the voices from beyond the great void, it is time to part ways. First of all, Emily, thank you for shedding light on the revitalization of text-based and narrative-driven games and the exciting future that they hold. And as always, to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, remember, keep creating, exploring, and sharing your stories with the world. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.